whole situation was a very hush-hush affair, in actual fact. There was nothing came through as far as I was concerned anyway. I knew nothing of it, and I was very much in the dark. The reason for volunteering was to assist the war effort because they had actually called for it, and they would not have called for it unless it was necessary. And I didn't anticipate anything going wrong anyway, because I had faith in our service areas. I'm afraid I didn't even think of my health. I didn't even think that we would suffer as much as we did.
Volunteers arrive at the station in batches of approximately 50 at a time. They are given a talk which explains to them the object of the experiments, and sweepstakes are often arranged, the winner, oddly enough, being the man who gets the worst burns.
Well, the first day we went into the gas chambers, they give us these camouflage uniforms, and some were all right. They're supposed to have been protective gearing, but they weren't protective gearing, I can assure you that. They were, the one I had on was torn in around the legs, both arms, and on the back and on the front. I thought there was something fishy going on then. And when we went into the gas chambers there was about five or six, I'm not quite sure, and the sergeant. And he put this gas cylinder on the floor and opened it up, and we let it go for, I suppose, about 10 minutes, quarter of an hour.
In the gas chamber itself, it was rather a hectic situation. When we went in, the object of the exercise was to pick up gunny sacks filled with sand from one corner of the chamber and carry it across to the other corner of the chamber. It was not long before we were covered in perspiration, or actually sweat. This went through all our clothing. It picked up the gas that was in the air and clung to the uniforms. After a couple of hours, we really became very, very tired. And this was sensed by the boys and the girls from the RAP areas.
When you had gas chamber duty, everybody took their turn at it. You would sing to them, or you would tell them funny stories, or even just poke faces at them just through the windows, just anything to keep them amused. Because even though they did some physical labour in there were times when they were resting, and it must have been very boring for them.
The girls kept us going by singing songs of Australiana. In fact, I can still hear this track winding back coming through the PA.
Along the road to Gandhagay, where the blue gums are growing, the Murrumbidgee is flowing beneath clear summer skies, where my mommy and daddy are waiting for me, and the pals of my childhood once more will I see.
And just before we came out, they asked us to lift the sides of our gas masks, and then we just filed out. We had to go and sleep in our uniforms and everything.
Everywhere where the uniform was sweaty and collected this gas became completely sore and completely impregnated. The worst areas affected were obviously where the dampness was, and in between the crotch and up under the armpits and around the backs of the legs, where the actual sweat accumulated and carried the gas.
And the next day it started to come up in all little blisters, and from there on, day after day, they got bigger and bigger and bigger, until the fourth day they were just one big sheet of blisters. Well, I was burnt, I reckon about 95% I was burnt all over, and all around me private and that. You could hardly walk in the finish. You was It was that bad.
I think the second thing we did at Innisfail was to build an assault course. There were climbs over great ladders and going across rope crossings, but there was a particular refinement. We built a sort of cage of liana vines, which every few days we went out to the jungle and got more vines, so that it was extremely hard for anyone to go through this cage of tangled vines and not rub their arms and shoulders in order to try and exacerbate the pain they were feeling from their burns.
Corporal Stevens, get a move on, you're dragging your feet. Sergeant Thompson, once more over the scaffold, and then on.
By that time, the bravery of the Japanese soldiers was well understood. Many might stay in a foxhole, injured almost unto death, and still have a grenade ready to throw at our people who came past. So it was explained that only by going to the limit of their own endurance with the burns could we even manage to equal the courage of the enemy they had to fight.
Unfortunately, perhaps fortunately, we had Australian volunteers who are extremely pig-headed, and they would go for ages, long after you thought it was possible for human beings to go. I don't know whether any other troops would have gone for quite as long as they did, because it seemed almost miraculous that some of them could keep going for as long as they did.
On one occasion, when we had some severely burned men, we were visited by some senior medical officers who'd come out from Britain. And I think one may even have been a general. And Gorrell spoke to the volunteers and asked them would they drop their pants and simply show how serious their injuries were. And they all said, these men are casualties, they can't do anything, should be hospitalised. So Gorrell said, well, go ahead. So the men pulled up their pants and put on their webbing again, went over the assault course, marched away to camp afterwards.
Every morning we had to report to the doctor. He said to me after 2.5 weeks, Morris, why don't you give up? And I said, but you don't want me to give up, really. What you want to find out is the extent to which I would become a casualty in the case of a gas attack. He said, that's right. So I said, well, and my corporal with me agreed, we could go on. So at the end of the 3rd week, we decided, well, that we'd both had enough anyway. We were weeping blood, and so we said, that's enough.
In this case, the volunteer was in such pain after going over the first obstacle in the assault course that he was forced to give up. This meant that he had failed to complete the standard daily exercise, and he was therefore classed as partially disabled.
It was with great relief that we got out into that bed, eventually in the hospital.
Well, I got to about 3 parts up, and I just flaked right out and fell backwards on the ground, and they picked me up and took me in put me in the stretcher and took me back to the top floor of the Innisfail Hospital. And we were up there. I suppose we were up there for nearly 3 weeks before we were able to get around properly. And the sister used to come around each day and be peeling off big sheets of skin, and it was just like red raw underneath, and you couldn't bear the sheets on you. You all slept on the nutty. then we had this officer used to come around, a British officer, and he said, well done, lads. And sure enough, we were well done all right. We were like pieces of raw steak.
If a man retains enough use of his arms and eyes to allow him to fire a weapon, admission to hospital does not necessarily make him totally disabled. During his stay in hospital, which was necessitated solely because of the condition of the scrotum, this volunteer was classed as partially disabled. The hospital, particularly the mattress and sheets, was greatly appreciated by the volunteers, and some difficulty was often encountered in persuading them to leave.
As the trials became more advanced, Sinclair, the British scientist, considerably improved our recording methods. He designed a little mannequin, back and front on cards, in which we entered the serial number or some reference to the volunteer, together with the conditions of the exposure, temperature, concentration and dose. Each day we examined these men and sketched on the cards in red the areas where they had been burned in various degrees.
And I remember one particular time Mr. Legg had examined a boy that I was going out with. He brought his card out and handed it to me and said, "Here, you'll have to behave yourself now." And I took one look at it and said to him, "My love is like a red rose." I thought that was rather funny, but the poor boy was probably suffering very badly, and it probably wasn't very funny at all for him.
We were a very close-knit community. We had to depend on each other, all of us, for our own fun, entertainment, and I dare say we depended on each other too for safety in what we were doing. I don't think really that we were aware of how really dangerous it was. I don't recall, thinking, my God, I've got to go out into that mustard gas and do what I've got to do. The Mission Beach trials were held early in February, and we had to get up very early and drive quite a long way down to the area that was to be bombed. When we got to the beach, we had to get out and position our instruments on the first line of the dunes. Then we had to get into our protective clothing with respirators and wade out as far as we could into the sea to be out of range of the mustard gas when it was discharged. And then we just waited until the bombers came over, and I can still see them as they flew around Dunk Island and headed for the beach, and then they discharged their load of evil-looking red liquid. One of the boys had vomited into his respirator, and we girls felt very smug because we didn't vomit into our respirators. We felt we were really a much tougher breed than the boys. And just felt sorry for the poor fellow. Could you imagine vomiting into a respirator and having to keep it on? We were told right from the beginning that there was to be absolutely no discussion anywhere outside about what we were doing, and my letters were censored very heavily.
We were continually put in a big hut and hammered with secrecy, and they used many different forms. Some fellows signed papers and everything, but the secrecy was a big thing about it.